Michael Drayton was an English poet who came to prominence in the Elizabethan era. Early life. Drayton was born at Harts Hill, near Nuneaton, Warwickshire, England. Almost nothing is known about his early life, beyond the fact that in 1580 he was in the service of Thomas Goodyear of Collingham, Nottinghamshire. 19th and 20th century scholars, on the basis of scattered allusions in his poems and dedications, suggested that Drayton might have studied at the University of Oxford, and been intimate with the Polesworth branch of the Goodyear family. More recent work has cast doubt on those speculations. Literary career. In 1590 he produced his first book, The Harmony of the Church, a volume of spiritual poems, dedicated to Lady Devereux. It is notable for a version of the Song of Solomon, executed with considerable richness of expression. However, with the exception of 40 copies, seized by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the whole edition was destroyed by public order. Nevertheless, Drayton published a vast amount within the next few years. In 1593 appeared Idea, the Shepherd's Garland, a collection of 9 pastorals, in which he celebrated his own love sorrows under the poetic name of Roland. The basic idea was expanded in a cycle of 64 sonnets, published in 1594, under the title of Idea's Mirror, by which we learn that the lady lived by the river Ancor in Warwickshire. It appears that he failed to win his idea, and lived and died a bachelor. It has been said Drayton's sonnets possess a direct, instant, and universal appeal, by reason of the simple, straightforward ring, and foreshadowed the smooth style of Fairfax, Waller, and Dryden. Drayton was the first to bring the term ode, for a lyrical poem, to popularity in England, and was a master of the short, staccato anacaontics measure. Also in 1593 there appeared the first of Drayton's historical poems, The Legend of Piers Gaveston, and the next year saw the publication of Matilda, an epic poem in rhyme royal. It was about this time, too, that he brought out Endymion and Phoebe, a volume which he never republished, but which contains some interesting autobiographical matter, and acknowledgments of literary help from Thomas Lodge, if not from Edmund Spenser and Samuel Daniel also. In his Fig for Momus, Lodge reciprocated these friendly courtesies. In 1596 Drayton published his long and important poem Mortemeriados, a very serious production in ottava rima. He later enlarged and modified this poem, and republished it in 1603 under the title of The Barons' Wars. In 1596 also appeared another historical poem, The Legend of Robert Duke of Normandy, with which Piers Gaveston was reprinted. In 1597 appeared England's Heroical Epistles, a series of historical studies, in imitation of those of Ovid. These last poems, written in the heroic couplet, contain some of the finest passages in Drayton's writings. By 1597, the poet was resting on his laurels. It seems that he was much favoured at the court of Elizabeth, and he hoped that it would be the same with her successor. But when, in 1603, he addressed a poem of compliment to James I on his accession, it was ridiculed, and his services rudely rejected. His bitterness found expression in a satire, The Owl, but he had no talent in this kind of composition. Not much more entertaining was his scriptural narrative of Moses in a map of his miracles, a sort of epic in heroics printed the same year. In 1605 Drayton reprinted his most important works, his historical poems and The Idea, in a single volume which ran through 8 editions during his lifetime. He also collected his smaller pieces, hitherto unedited, in a volume undated, but probably published in 1605, under the title of Poems Lyric and Pastoral. These consisted of odes, eclogues, and a fantastic satire called The Man in the Moon. Some of the odes are extremely spirited. In this volume he printed for the first time the famous Ballad of Agincourt. He had adopted as early as 1598 the extraordinary resolution of celebrating all the points of topographical or antiquarian interest in the island of Great Britain, and on this laborious work he was engaged for many years. At last, in 1613, the first part of this vast work was published under the title of Polyolbion, 18 books being produced, to which the learned Selden supplied notes. The success of this great work, which has since become so famous, was very small at first, and not until 1622 did Drayton succeed in finding a publisher willing to undertake the risk of bringing out 12 more books in a second part. This completed the survey of England, and the poet, who had hoped to crown Scotland with flowers, and arrive at last at the Orcades, never crossed the Tweed. In 1627 he published another of his miscellaneous volumes, and this contains some of his most characteristic writing. It consists of the following pieces: The Battle of Agincourt, an historical poem in ottava rima, and The Miseries of Queen Margaret, written in the same verse and manner. Nymphidia, The Court of Fairy, a most joyous and graceful little epic of fairyland. The Quest of Cynthia and the Shepherds, Irena, 2 lyrical pastorals, and finally The Moon Calf, a sort of satire. Nymphidia is the most critically acclaimed. Along with his famous ballad on the Battle of Agincourt, it is quite unique of its kind and full of rare fantastic fancy. The last of Drayton's voluminous publications was the Muses Elysium in 1630. He died in London, was buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, and had a monument placed over him by the Countesses of Dorset, with memorial lines attributed to Ben Jonson. Theatre. Like other poets of his era, Drayton was active in writing for the theatre, but unlike Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, or Samuel Daniel, he invested little of his art in the genre. For a period of only 5 years, from 1597 to 1602, Drayton was a member of the stable of playwrights who supplied material for the theatrical syndicate of Philip Henslowe. Henslow's diary links Drayton's name with 23 plays from that period, and shows that Drayton almost always worked in collaboration with other Henslowe regulars, like Thomas Dekker, Anthony Munday, and Henry Chettle, among others. Of these 23 plays, only one has survived, that being Part 1 of Sir John Oldcastle, which Drayton composed in collaboration with Munday, Robert Wilson, and Richard Hathway. The text of Oldcastle shows no clear signs of Drayton's hand, traits of style consistent through the entire corpus of his poetry are wholly absent for the text, suggesting that his contribution to the collaborative effort was not substantial. William Longsword, the one play that Henslow's diary suggests was a solo Drayton effort, was never completed. Friendships. Drayton was a friend of some of the most famous men of the age. He corresponded familiarly with Drummond, Ben Jonson, William Browne, George Wither, and others were among his friends. There is a tradition that he was a friend of Shakespeare, supported by a statement of John Ward, once vicar of Stratford-on-Avon, that Shakespeare, Drayton and Ben Jonson had a merry meeting, and, it seems, drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever that contracted. Quote, in one of his poems, An Elegy or Epistle to Mr. Henry Reynolds, he has left some valuable criticisms on poets whom he had known. That he was a restless and discontented, as well as a worthy man, may be gathered from his own admissions. Additions. In 1748 a folio edition of Drayton's complete works was published under the editorial supervision of William Oldys, and again in 1753 there appeared an issue in 4 volumes quarto. but these were very unintelligently and inaccurately prepared. A complete edition of Drayton's works with variant readings was projected by Richard Hooper in 1876, but was never carried to a conclusion. A volume of selections, edited by A. H. Bullen, appeared in 1883. See especially Oliver Elton, Michael Drayton. A complete 5-volume edition of Drayton's work was published by Oxford in 1931-41, edited by J. William Habel, K. Tillotson and B. H. Newdigate. That and a 2-volume edition of Drayton's poems published at Harvard in 1953, edited by John Buxton, are the only 20th-century editions of his poems recorded by the Library of Congress.